Today's episode of the Counselling Tutor Podcast is sponsored by Web Healer. You're a counsellor in private practice and you need a website, or you've got an existing website which you need help with. Web Healer are offering Counselling Tutor Podcast listeners, that's you, £100 off the cost of a website design and build. Now, Web Healer specialise in websites for counsellors and psychotherapists. It's what they do. And the Web Healer team provide a completely non-technical, done-for-you solution, leaving you to focus your time on your clients. Operating for 20 years, Web Healer are a trusted resource amongst counsellors when it comes to getting your practice online. So get the package details and claim your £100 off coupon for your new website by going to counsellingtutor.com/website. That's counsellingtutor.com/website.
Welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for counsellors, psychotherapists, and counselling students. Here are your hosts, Rory Oakes and Ken Kelly.
Hi, I'm Rory and welcome to episode 283 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Today we're thrilled to have yet another remarkable guest with us, Nikaela Morrison. Nikaela is a practice manager and shares her insights into the fascinating area of work of being a practice manager. She also shares insights into her new project, Trainbee, an online platform which connects students to placement opportunities. So stay to the end to hear her fascinating insights.
Thank you, Rory. Yes, this is episode 283. Both Rory and I are delighted that you've joined us. And we've got 3 stops on today's journey, starting off with our student services, where today we're looking at idiosyncratic empathy, taking that empathy and digging a little bit deeper into what that means. In our ethical sustainable practice today, we're going to be having a look at legal obligations that we have as counsellors, as psychotherapists, and in relation specifically today to the coroner's court. What are we bound by? What do we need to take in consideration when we're keeping our notes and if our notes are requested? And as Rory has already mentioned, really you want to stay tuned to listen to Nikaela speaking in Practice Matters about being a practice manager and her exciting project that she has on at the moment. So Rory, how are you today as we go into this student services and in idiosyncratic empathy?
I'm very, very well, thank you. We start talking about idiosyncratic empathy, and it's a really interesting aspect to counselling. And I think I'm going to start by just outlining what idiosyncratic empathy was. It was a term coined by Gerald Bozarth in a book called Beyond Reflection, Empathy. And interestingly enough, he talked about developing empathic responses in I guess a congruent way. So let me kind of frame that. When we start skills practice, and certainly when I started skills practice, my empathic responses was something like, well, that sounds scary, or that sounds sad, or it sounds like you really don't want to do that. And they're really off the peg responses. And I think a lot of students do off the peg responses. Idiosyncratic empathy is a more tailored approach to the clients. It's almost like the difference between getting an off-the-peg set of clothes and a made-to-measure set of clothes. And Bozarth says in the book, it comes authentically from me as an individual. It is response to another as an individual, and it arises from a here and now context. And I think yes, it's quite telling, that, isn't it? Here and now context. And I can remember working with a client who was telling me something. We'd been working together for some time. It was a male client working together for some time, and he was saying about something that was happening in his life, I think by his employer, and his employer had told him a real pack of lies, and I said, that sounds like bollocks. To which he said, that's exactly what it is. And he lit up. And at that point, Ken, a door opened, another door,
yes.
and we walked together. Together, we walked through that door into a new understanding of each other. He understood me as someone who wasn't scared to call it as it was and to see his frame of reference. And he walked through that door understanding that I was trying my hardest to see his world, and I called it absolutely correctly. And it went on to become quite a seminal, for me as a therapist, piece of work, and a complete piece of work. But it started with me taking a chance and me really kind of using, a mild swear word, because it was so accurate to where the client was. And that, I think, is an example. That's one example of idiosyncratic empathy.
Very, very, very good example. And the interesting thing about the example you've used is it is truly idiosyncratic. And I want to start with that word of what is idiosyncratic. When we get words, I love going to the root of the meaning. And idiosyncratic is defined as relating to the individual. So it's individualistic, as you said, not off the peg, Rory, but bespoke, especially for that person. And the word you used in that interaction could have been really out of context and inappropriate with a different client. But with this client, it was appropriate. It was idiosyncratic empathy within that moment. We can tell that it resonated. A door was open, a spark. The person lit up. They said, yes, you hear me, you get me. And that is the whole part of empathy, isn't it? It is, we listen empathically, and then we reflect back in such a way that the client feels heard. It's like a circle empathy, just listening and not saying anything back, and then you can be as empathic as you like in your mind, but until we feed it back in some way that the client feels it, then the circle of empathy is complete, as in this example that you've just given. And when it resonates, when it's individualistic, idiosyncratic, in that moment, it can be so incredibly powerful. And I guess in those early stages of learning our skills and what we need to do for active listening, we learn about empathy and we study empathy, idiosyncratic empathy. It's the level down. It's the more seasoned practitioner. It comes from experience. It comes from our clients teaching us. And it comes from really listening to who that person is. And, it's interesting when we speak about idiosyncratic or empathy in its as a standalone. We're looking from their frame of reference. That's the whole thing about empathy. And I guess what we need to watch out for is that our own self-concept or our own frame of reference doesn't overlap within that. So we've defined what empathy is, what idiosyncratic empathy is, but now we're looking at what might be the traps that can kind of trip you up when you're working empathically, Rory.
Yes, and I think the first thing that can trip you up is maybe not listening at a deep enough level and coming from our own frame of reference. So, the first thing about using empathy is that deep listening, making sure that you're hearing the client. And also, I think with idiosyncratic empathy, being aware of the relationship you have. I don't think people could do it. I think it'd be tough to do idiosyncratic empathy the first session. I think this is where you and the client know each other. You're building that relationship. So here's the thing. Idiosyncratic empathy speaks to both congruence and rapport. And also, I think we just have to be careful. We don't come from our own frame of reference, that our responses are how we'd respond to that situation. What you're doing is you're reframing your response to where the sense you get the client is coming from that position. Yeah. That's the important bit. And it does take a bit of skill, to be honest. I've had when I was a student, I had some quite spectacular misses, thinking that's what's happening. And they've gone, no, wasn't like that at all.
Yeah.
So you have to practice it, but that's why you practice it as a student, I guess.
Very much so. I love what you've said there, and I think it's good that we acknowledge when we kind of maybe step a foot out of somebody's frame of reference, and it's not necessarily a bad thing because it does give the client opportunity to reframe you in their frame of reference. When we maybe feed something back or try to empathically respond to what the person is saying, and it doesn't resonate, it's helpful to us when the client sets us right on that. And, it's understandable, Rory, that you would have maybe misstepped in those early stages of learning empathy because we operate from our own self-concept, who we are. It's the truths that we hold in our own life, and it's rooted from before our first actual recallable memories. It's in our culture, our childhood, our belief structures that we were brought up with, our race, our sexuality. It's all encompasses who we believe we are as individuals. And truly being empathic, truly seeing something from another's frame of reference is about putting that aside, or at least recognizing when our own stuff might surface. And of course, the place where this is honed to perfection is in personal development. It's interesting that you would think that to be empathic, it would be spending more time with other people, listening to them to really exercise that muscle. And yes, that is true. But first, we need to look at ourselves and work on understand who we really are, so that we're able to distinguish when our stuff might interrupt and come up and kind of cloud that being in the person's frame of reference, Rory. And I often hear, from students that kind of feedback along their journey, they might share about their personal development groups. Some find it more useful than others. Some might be saying, "Oh, this person in my PD group really gets my goat, brings up emotions in me." And that's the whole point of it. You're there for you. It's personal development. If you're there and somebody brings up a point or talks too long or does something that brings up an emotion in you, that is coming from your self-concept, from who you are, who you believe you are. It's in your frame of reference. What is causing that? And it's a great place to examine what maybe the seed of that might be. And again, going into personal therapy. The question sometimes comes up, why do I really have to go into personal therapy to be there for others? But again, when we go into that personal therapy, if we look at it as our own personal growth and development and learning who we are, the more we know ourselves, the more we are able to be there fully with that client that is in front of us, Rory. So it's interesting that when we speak about empathy, that maybe looking within is a great place to hone that skill.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more, Ken. I think it's about knowing yourself enough not to put too much of yourself, in other words, your own experience, and coming from your own experience into the relationship. It's about that client's experience. It's about what's going on for that client, and you trying to get to the music, the melody behind what the client's saying. And I think there's one other important part of idiosyncratic empathy, and I was asked about this recently. And if we think of what Bozarth said, comes authentically from me as an individual, is in response to another as an individual, and arises from an here and now context. Somebody said to me, "Well, you're a trauma-informed practitioner." I said, "Yes, I worked in a trauma-informed way." And he said, "What would happen if, in your person-centered?" I said, "Yes, we've got a person-centered base." "What would happen if a client said to me, 'I don't know why I didn't run away when I was attacked'?" Now, the traditional way would be, it seems like you're really confused about why you couldn't run away from that person. An idiosyncratic response, maybe, actually, I can tell you what I know. I can tell you what I know about that, if you'd like that. And the client would say yes, and I'd say, and I may go and explain, as a trauma-informed practitioner, having done a course, having trained, I've been in practice for many years, and explained in very kind of straightforward terms how the brain works in a stressful situation. And it's either flight, or flee, fight or flee. And I think that's an idiosyncratic response, because you're not imposing on the client. You're saying, the here and now context is, I could tell you, what I know about that. I'm responding to the other as an individual, and it comes authentically from me. And I've done that many times, and I can tell you, again, the doors open, the relationships deepen. There's almost a healing done.
Yeah.
Where some people would say, so it wasn't my fault. And I say, no, that's just how your brain reacts in a stressful situation. And again, the amount of healing and the amount of therapeutic movement, just me saying I could share what I know is incredible, Ken.
And so powerful, and 100% idiosyncratic. So you're speaking from a base of experience and a base of doing training within a specific area. And you're 100% right that within that situation, that is a very empathic and very in-service response to that client. Out of context, without the training, and maybe out of that context, a similar kind of feedback would not be empathic. And I'm going to give you an example. So you started off by sharing the person who shared with you what was going on within their working environments, and your response was very idiosyncratic and opened a door. The opposite side of it is the rescuing of, well, have you thought of looking for another job? Or maybe it's not that bad. And have you spoken to your... So, we're trying to help. Of course we're trying to help, but it would show maybe an inexperienced therapist not reflecting back how it is for that person, but going into their own rescuing phase of my frame of reference. I don't want you to have this terrible feeling where you find yourself at the moment. And it would not be... in best service of the client at that moment, because it basically says, let's rip you out of where you find yourself and tell you something else, and let's try and find a way to fix this, which is not what we do as counsellors. However, in the example that you've used, where a person has experienced trauma and is carrying a weight from that trauma, from an action that they took or didn't take within that moment, using the psychological education, as you kind of lay out what you know based on your training and your experience, it is 100% appropriate. And I think this is the thing about idiosyncratic empathy, that you can share or empathically share with one client that would resonate as in idiosyncratic empathy would not necessarily fit or work for the next client who comes in. It is so individualistic. And I think that is the beauty, the wonder and the power of idiosyncratic empathy, but also on the other side, the frustration of, well, then how do I learn this? I almost want a blueprint, Rory, that tells me exactly what to do.
Well, here's the blueprint. Here's the blueprint. As a student, how many times have I sat in front of my supervisor, wringing my hands and pulling myself apart, saying, should I say to the client that about how the brain works, or should I respond to the client and say what a rubbish experience this person's having? And I think as a student, and I think it actually goes for someone who's been practicing a few years, check it out with your supervisor, because your supervisor is your critical friend, hopefully your critical friend, and they will. A good supervisor will investigate, where is this empathic response coming from? Is it coming from authentically as you as an individual in response to another and arising in the here and now context, or is it coming from your own experience? And I think that working that out in therapy, working that out in supervision is really, really important. I think it's incredibly important as a student that anything that you use, you check out, you have a look at it with your supervisor, and a good supervisor will welcome that. It's not a case of, have I got it wrong? Am I in trouble? Am I on the naughty seat? It's a case of, this is an experiment. Let's see how this works. Let's get down to it. I love supervising students for that reason. Let's have a look at it. Let's see what's going on in the relationship. and check it out with your supervisor, and that will hone that approach. I don't think it's a skill as such. It's an approach, a personal approach to your client work, but it will hone it. And I think it'll give you the wisdom to know when to use it and when not to use it.
Very, very well said there, Rory. And you mentioned you love being a supervisor and working with students for that reason. And I think that as qualified practitioners, we also need to consider maybe a retrospective view of a session. Maybe a client brought something and we wanted to say something and didn't say it, or we did say something and it resonated very clearly or very, very powerfully, or we did say something and it didn't resonate powerfully. It kind of fell dead. A retrospective view of that, of kind of making a note in your own personal scribbles to take in to supervision. It is fertile ground for exploring. I was in with this client. This client shared this, and I was torn. I wanted to say this, but I found myself saying this. And you can spend a lot of time in a supervision session on one tiny interaction. But having that retrospective look, definitely, rich learning, I guess. And you're right, Rory. It's not a skill. It's often mentioned as a skill, but I like the way Rogers describes it. It's a way of being. Empathy is a way of being. It's who you are, and it's how you show up, and it's the way you are within that environment. And of course, idiosyncratic empathy is just a deeper form of that. And I guess if there's a challenge or a call out for this, is have a look within your own sessions. If you're a student and you're practicing skills, do you see idiosyncratic empathy? Can you feel it when somebody is when you're the client and somebody else is being the listener? Or if you are in placement, do you see it within your clients? Do you feel it anywhere within your clients? If you're in practice, of course, have a look across your clients. Do you see it there? Can you recognize it? Can you go, you know what, that is idiosyncratic empathy right over there. And of course, as always, there's a super duper handout. Now, the super duper handout today was not created by Rory. It comes from my book, Basic Counselling Skills, a Student Guide, which is available on Amazon. There you go. I've put my plug in there. plug. Great book for students. It really is. It basically walks you through the skills, and it's a little bit of part of a chapter taken out. It's from the empathy chapter on idiosyncratic empathy. You can get that for free. Where do you go? Go to counsellingtutor.com, click on the podcast tab, find your way to episode 283, today's episode, and download it. It's free of charge. It's right there on the page, and you will have your idiosyncratic empathy handout in your hands. Student Services is sponsored by Counselling Skills Academy. Have you ever wondered if you're using counselling skills effectively? Confidentiality means we rarely see skills used by others, so it's no wonder that so many students say they lack confidence in their counselling skills. That's why I built Counselling Skills Academy. Counselling Skills Academy is an online course that you can do at your own pace. It will give you the skills competence and confidence to know that you're using your skills most effectively. You will see real counselling skills used by a counsellor in real life sessions, covering everything from how risk is assessed right through to working towards an appropriate ending. Visit counsellingskillsacademy.com to learn more and to claim your counselling tutor discount. That's counsellingskillsacademy.com. And as we leave the student services in the background, I'm looking in my rear view mirror, a lot of metaphors going on today, Rory. I'm looking in my mirror and see student services going into the background. We move into our ethical, sustainable practice. This is why where we recognize, that when we train, our core training to become a counsellor, a psychotherapist, very little of that time is spent on setting up a private practice, how we act in private practice, the business side of running a practice, the office administration side of running a private practice. So we like to take those topics and discuss them as peers here on the Counselling Tutor Podcast. And today, we want to speak about legal obligations. We keep notes from our clients, and specifically legal obligations in relation to the coroner's court. And of course, we speak from the United Kingdom. So we speak of the law that we work to here, the legislation we work to here in the United Kingdom. And of course, outside of the United Kingdom, you would need to look to your own legislation. But I would be surprised if it was that much different, Rory.
Yes, as Ken said, I think you'd have to look to your own legislation. And I guess this topic has been brought about by someone who posted in our Facebook page. And if you're a regular listener, you'll hear me say this all the time, so please bear with me. But if you're new to us, so if you are, hello and welcome, hope you're enjoying it so far. Go to Facebook, type in Counselling Tutor. You'll find our Facebook group, and there's a great conversation going on in there about all sorts of things related to counselling. And one that came up was someone was saying, I don't know anything about the coroner. What should I do? Can you give me any advice or observations to help me? So I think the first thing I would say is that a coroner is somebody who is charged legally to try and investigate the causes of death here in the UK. So in cases like this, it's either violent death, unexplained death, or a death that there's no circumstances around. In other words, they're not quite sure why someone's died. And the coroner's duty is twofold. One is to give a verdict on what happened in that death. So was it a death by misadventure? Was it death by someone taking their own life? Was it a death by negligence? And they can make a ruling on that. And then from that, other people may pick that up. But one of the key parts of a coroner's work is what's called PFDs, which is preventing future deaths. So the whole point of a coroner is lessons learned, so that we don't repeat them again. And a PFD, very simply put, is a opinion given by the coroner usually to organisations to prevent future deaths. And it can be a recommendation. And usually when the coroner recommends you do something, you're probably best doing it. And in terms of therapists, it's one of the 3 occasions where you have to surrender. If asked, you have to surrender your notes. So let's go through those 3 occasions. First occasion is client asks for the notes. They're entitled to that under UK GDPR. Okay. Second is if a judge issues a court order. This isn't the police phoning up and asking for the notes. This is a judge issuing a court order. And I'll say a little bit about that. If our colleagues at the police ask for notes, the correct response would be to say, well, if I was working with that client, I'll ask them and I'd get their permission. Yeah. And the police know that. The police know that. They know that's the drill. They have to do their job and we have to do ours. And if the Crown Prosecution Service wants those notes, then they can go to a court and they can get a court order and you have to surrender them. Here's the thing, it hardly ever happens. It hardly ever happens. And then finally, the topic we're talking about today is coroner. And if a coroner asks for your notes, you have to surrender them. And they would issue you with a form of summons, I guess. And you may have to go to the court to discuss and be cross-examined, if you like, by the coroner and asked about this situation. And I'll give you an example of that. Many years ago, there was a therapist working, I think, in the NHS who was working with a woman who was pregnant, and she was very depressed and she took her own life. And there was an investigation into it. And what happened was the coroner asked the counsellor, have you done any training to work with pregnant women who may have suicidal intent? And the answer was no. And I think, from what I remember, it was left there. But I wouldn't be surprised if the coroner issued the health service with what's called a PFD, preventing future deaths, and may have recommended that people who are doing that work have training. And I would say also it's nothing to be frightened of. It's nothing to be frightened of. All they're trying to do for the families is to get some kind of idea of what's gone on. And also a coroner's job is to try to find out the cause of death and what may have led to it. But also, the big part of their work, I think, is preventing future deaths, is to look at those lessons. What can we learn? And let's not have that tragedy again if we can prevent it.
Yeah. I'm going to share that I've been contacted by a coroner in my practice. I'm not going to say much more than that, but I was very glad that when looking at my contracting, when working with my supervisor, we spent a whole session within supervision of all the areas where I would need to break confidentiality or share notes, and they were all included in my contract, including that if a coroner asked for that, they would need to be handed over. What I can share is in my experience of this happening, it was the police that actually phoned. So the coroner was acting within the police service. They identified firstly that they were the police service, and then secondly that it was the coroner. They requested my notes for a client that I hadn't been seeing for well over a year. And I think that reflects the importance of proper note taking, proper note storage, and being able to retrieve that information when you are legally bound to do so. And then the last thing that I will share on my experience in going through this is that with the help of my supervisor, because they will generally give you some time, they will contact you and they will give you a time period in which to submit. In working with my supervisor, I was able to negotiate not handing over all of the notes. I was able to negotiate with the coroner, handing over a summary that pertained to the information that they were looking for. So rather than them having every one of the sessions notes that the client had brought, they got information that pertained to where they were looking and the questions that they were asking. And in that instance, they were satisfied with that. So that is from the experience, and I know what you say, Rory, of you don't need to be frightened of it, because it is a process, and it is a process we need to understand, we need to predict and think about, so that when it does come along, we are prepared for it. It gave me a bit of a butterfly tummy, Rory, going through that. And you're 100% right in that the prevention of future deaths, they do look to... They may ask some quite uncomfortable questions about your competences and your training and your ability to work with certain areas. So again, that reflects the importance of CPD on looking at how do we work if somebody is a high risk. How do we work with that? How do we identify the high risk in the first place? How do we then manage that? If a client suggests that they are thinking of taking their own life, or that they have thoughts of that, how do we work with it without it being too violent and knee-jerk? It all comes down to continuing professional development, looking at the legislation, understanding it, making sure you're covering what is important within your contract, that you are making the client aware of that when you are contracting with them, and then going through the process when it comes along, safe in the knowledge that you keep your notes well for the required time wherever you find yourself in the world. So there's a lot that kind of comes into play of running a professional practice when we find ourselves in these situations, Rory.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much for pointing out that the police do approach you on behalf of the coroner. You're absolutely right. But the key thing is there, in that instance, the coroner is in fact, for want of a better phrase, the judge requesting your notes. It's actually, that's the process. And I think the other thing to consider is I've had to give statements on 2 occasions to the coroner, not related to counselling, more personal circumstances. And one of the things that struck me was the person who was taking the note was a PCSO. They're legal documents. You're being interviewed. You're not being interviewed under caution. But when you're speaking to the person who's taking the notes, they're legal documents. They'll form part of the legal process that will be presented in a court. So I'm not saying that you should make things up by any stretch of the imagination. Please don't do that. But be thoughtful that what you say is going to be a part of the court record. And maybe worth considering. Ken mentioned about doing a précis of the notes. I do know that in cases of where a judge asks for your notes, it used to be the case you could do a précis. Now I believe, I've done some CPD around this recently, and now I believe it's actually, you have to actually surrender your notes. So please check it. And in my experience, they're really good. When I've spoken with the coroners, they're really, really good. The people who work with them, not particularly the coroner, you don't get to speak to the coroner, but speaking to the people who support that process, they're really helpful. They're really open. They're really supportive, I have to say. And I've done this on 2 occasions, 2 very difficult personal tragedies that happened in my life. And they were very, very supportive, very, very understanding. And in a couple of cases, that there was a little bit of flexibility. And so, yes, when that letter comes to your door, onto your doormat, yes, there's obviously 2 processes going on. One is that the client you've worked with has died, and that's impactful. And the other, of course, is the process you've got to go through if asked by a coroner. In both those cases, it's about supervision. I know we always talk, but supervision, get some support in supervision, because a lot will play out in that. And it's not unusual. I've supervised people who've had to give coroner statements. And, sometimes they may think that if they'd just done more, if they'd just been a little bit more, counselling, or they'd done another intervention. And, as I say to them, I say, well, that's not the case. It's when people come to take their own lives, there's many factors in that. So get some support. Don't be on your own with it if that happens. It is unsettling, I think, even for the most robust practitioner. But just go with the process, speak to your supervisor, speak to the coroner.
Yeah, it is unsettling, Rory, from a personal experience point, indeed, and it kind of brings up a lot. And I think maybe there's a whole other podcast topic on losing a client, because it can have a very hard impact. And it was so many mixed feelings and emotions for me personally. And one of them was, have I taken notes correctly? Are they professionally written? Because your notes, you're taking your notes all the time from the clients that you see, and 99% of the time it's just you seeing those, unless a client maybe asked for their notes, but then they were there and they knew what happened. And of course, a client may not be versed in how a counsellor might write notes. So that feeling came in of, have I done it correctly? Because now I'm handing them over to a fellow professional who not just going to be looking at, but scrutinizing those notes. Have I done it correctly? Did I store them correctly? I was so glad that I had them and I had easy access to them through the system that I was using at the time. And I think maybe a good time to mention, it's because of practice management, managing your practice, managing how you keep your notes, how you take them, how you store them, how you comply to data regulations can be really tricky. It really can. And, I was speaking to one of our team who is a student who graduated in 2023. And I think 20 minutes of their entire 4-year course was focused on compliance, GDPR compliance here in the UK, data protection compliance. It's a tiny drop, but yet we're instantly, if specifically we're going to private practice, called upon to do all of this under penalty of the law. There's legislation in place that we have to. We don't have a choice in that. Rory and I recognized this when GDPR came in, and for over 2 years we have been building a practice management application which is privacy first, data protection first, so not whistles and bells first, and compliance in terms of how notes are captured and stored and are retrievable. And of course, then we have the other side of that, and that's the right to be forgotten. You know, what do you do when a client says, I want the right to be forgotten and I don't want you to keep my notes? And this depends on where you are. You know, this is all supervision. But if you're interested, our practice management application is called Therapy Lock. If you go to counsellingtutor.com, it's right there on the front page. Just scroll down a little bit. You can join the waiting list. And early 2024, we'll send you an email to have a look at a demonstration of that if you are interested. But it's, you know, we're speaking about death, coroner's courts, those notes. It's enough to bring anxiety up in me today, Rory.
Yeah. Well, even speaking about it, I can feel a level of anxiety raising because, you know, it's out of the blue usually as well, isn't it? It's something that you don't expect. But I guess if you practice long enough, sadly, you know, this may happen. And I hope we've given you enough information today, at least to form a basis for you to be able to look at what you may do in that circumstance and get yourself some support. But it is part and parcel of ethical, sustainable practice. It's part and parcel of working as a practitioner. These things do sadly happen.
They do. Thank you for the topic, and that thanks goes out to our Counselling Tutor audience who suggested it in that Facebook group, and that is today's ethical, sustainable practice. And we move on now to Practice Matters. It's the CPD section of the Counselling Tutor podcast. You get to kind of track your CPD, write down that you listen to this. And CPD is anything that you do that is in service of your clients or your practice. You can mark that down as CPD. And we always try and focus on something that is important. And today, Practice Matters is an interview with Nikaela Morrison. Rory, you met up with Nikaela. I've met up with her as well beforehand. A beautiful person. And you were speaking about being a practice manager.
Yes, I mean, one of the things in this side of the podcast is that we talk to people who have got interesting jobs and are using their counselling skills, maybe in a or counselling qualifications, maybe in a slightly different role, but it goes to prove how many roles there are for people who are qualified. And I spoke to Nikaela about being a practice manager, but also about a little initiative, or not a little initiative, a great initiative of matching students to placements. And this is what she had to say.
Practice Matters is proudly sponsored by the Counsellor CPD Library. To access top quality, relevant continuing professional development for your practice that you can do at a time that suits you, and all for less than the price of a cup of coffee, visit counsellingtutor.com.
I think one of the opportunities for therapists that's sometimes overlooked is the fact that they can become placement managers for organisations. Placement managers really are the gatekeepers to organisations to make sure that students get the right placement, and also to make sure that they're a really good fit for the clients that placement offers. So it's with great pleasure I'm interviewing today Nikaela Morrison, who is a placement manager. So Nikaela, very welcome.
Thank you so much.
So I guess
Good to be here.
I guess my first question is, how did you get to be a placement manager? What happened? What's that process?
Right. So it's a funny story. I was at before I was at the organisation that I'm at now, I was working with a small team. We developed a social, emotional, mental health provision in a school, and it was the first one within the borough. And I was looking to transition out, and this organisation, Spark to Life, I'd worked for before. I'd kind of heard rumours about them wanting to develop a counselling arm of the organisation. And so I met with the CEO and I said, I'd like to do that. And so he took me on. He created the role of therapeutic coordinator. and he took me on. So I spent the last 2 years developing the counselling service from the ground up, and also within the organisation managing other projects around that kind of thing.
It sounds brilliant and such an important role, developing just not only the placement aspect but developing the service as well. I mean that is incredible. Yeah. One of the questions I get asked a lot, certainly from our students or student audience, is what do you look for when you are recruiting students? There's a lot of stress around this, but what is it you're looking for?
What is it we look for? I would say there's a few things that we're looking for, but I would say the most important things that I'm looking for when I'm recruiting a trainee counsellor would be a passion. And I'd say a passion not just for counselling as an art, but the client group that we serve, that we work with, because we have a specific client group. We are set in a particular area. We work with a particular type of people, and so we want to know that they are passionate about the client group, that they have an interest in working with the client group, and if they've had experience with that client group, that's even better, and not just therapeutically, but generally as well.
Okay, and would you want to share the client group that your organisation specialises in or works with predominantly?
Yeah, so Spark to Life, we're an organisation that work with predominantly young people that are affected or caught up in the criminal justice system. And so we work with those that are currently caught up in a lifestyle of criminality, or who are vulnerable to criminal exploitation, or are rehabilitating and trying to reintegrate into society. And so that's the kind of client group that we're working with. And so, it's very specific, but we also offer our counselling service to other volunteers within our organisation. So we have volunteer mentors and volunteers that work with the parents of some of our client group. So it's quite specific.
Yeah, and it sounds like very worthy work. We know that antisocial behaviour or criminal behaviour can be generated by traumatic life events or poor choices, or sometimes difficult family backgrounds. Yes. And having someone to listen and understand where someone comes from can be life changing. Absolutely,
it is life changing, and we do recognise that within the work that we do generally is a kind of casework and mentoring, therapeutic mentoring, and our organisation is quite keen on ensuring that all of our staff are trauma informed and trauma aware, and so to be able to have a counselling arm that speaks to that. Like you said, a lot of our client group, they've gone through adverse childhood experiences, and actually a lot of behaviours are perpetuated due to trauma.
Absolutely. I mean, I worked for NACRO for a time, which was called the National Association for the Care and Rehabilitation of Offenders. I think they've still got the name, but I don't think the acronym means that anymore. I stand to be corrected. And my experience with working with predominantly young men who'd come from an offending background was there was always a backstory. There was always a backstory, and usually quite a traumatic story, either neglect or poor parenting, difficult parenting or something like that, or just the environment they were brought up in. And they just needed maybe a bit of space after they'd paid the society back for their behaviour. to try and find a way forward. And the buzzword when I did it was called pro-social behaviour. I'm sure it's probably changed now. So I mean, I guess in terms of being a practice manager, what skills does it draw on other than being a therapist? When you're a placement manager, what other skills do you think you need?
I think you need to be organised, very organised, a good project manager, I would say. And I guess it depends what stage you come in at. I came in at a stage where this didn't exist within our organisation. And now we currently have 4 therapists working with us and still recruiting more. And so you definitely need to be able to manage projects and also have good initiative and be quite innovative. Develop the service. Also very patient. It's interesting, all 4 of my trainees currently, the process with them, whilst I've inducted and trained them in the same way, actually the process with them has been very different because they're all coming from different training centres, and so there's different requirements, and so I'm dealing with different types of course leads and different paperwork and different processes and requirements and expectations. And so it's just about navigating all of that and trying to do it in a really supportive way. I like to think that our trainees get a lot of support.
Yes, I mean, I think that is the secret, isn't it? I think a good placement, it has a very holistic approach to the people who volunteer with them, mainly trainees, I have to say. And it sounds like you're seeing each one as an individual, because they're all training, but they're being different places within that training, or different understanding of the theory, or maybe just generally a different approach, because if they're coming from different training providers, there may be a different flavour of approach, I guess. Exactly,
and they're all coming as well with different modalities, which you have to consider as well, especially if you're providing supervision. You also have to think about that, what modality that they're coming from.
Yeah, absolutely, because there is a number of modalities taught. And I guess if you're doing supervision or overview, you have to understand how those modalities are applied, to the client. Now you also have. I'm not going to use the word side hustle. I think that would be disrespecting what you do. But you certainly have another string to your bow, shall we say? And you own a company called Trainbee.co.uk. Well, we'll put the link into the show notes of this episode. So if you go to counsellingtutor.com and go to the podcast tab and go to episode 283, you'll find those show notes. So tell us about Trainbee.
Trainbee. Trainbee is definitely a passion project. And it was birthed out of my own experience of training to be a therapist. And so when I was studying to be a therapist, I had some difficulty with finding a placement, and not just a placement, because I felt that whatever placement I did, I needed to be invested in. And it needed to be interesting to me. And so I found it difficult to find a placement. And I heard kind of the voices of other classmates, and they also found it difficult. And then when I did start my placements, I did one in a school and I did one in a hospice. When I did start my placements, the placement managers also expressed kind of a difficulty in finding trainee counsellors. And so that's when the idea was kind of birthed. I just thought if trainees are struggling and placement providers are struggling, surely there must be a place where they can meet up. And I thought, let me create that space.
I mean, that is a brilliant initiative. So I guess if there's any training providers who are struggling to get, to get trainee therapists to do their hours, or alternatively, if there's any trainee therapists amongst you listening and you're struggling to get hours, if you go to trainbee.co.uk, and as I say, we'll put the link in the show notes. It's basically a marriage made in heaven, isn't it? People can it's like a bit like a dating app for
It is. It is. I am. Definitely it is.
Well, I mean, that's excellent. I guess one of the final questions is that one of the responsibilities of being a training manager in a placement is also to maybe deliver a bit of bad news to people and maybe give them feedback. I'm sure that there's been times where people have applied and they've just not been a good fit for you. Have you got any kind of recommendations or top tips on how to give feedback
and how to deliver?
Yeah, because it can be tricky, can't it?
Yeah, but do you know what I've found? I've found that the trainees that I've come across and I've interviewed, because there has been a few that I've interviewed that were unsuccessful, they are definitely keen to hear the feedback, and they're open and quite receptive to it. And so I would say just be honest, and give them the kind of feedback that you would want if you were unsuccessful and needing to land a placement, because they need to complete their hours. It is a requirement. And so I would say, whilst you couldn't give them the opportunity, I think it's important that you're able to give them the best chance. So definitely be honest. And we're therapists, so be therapeutic, be kind, be compassionate, be empathic, all of those things. And also a few of them, whilst I wasn't able to give them an opportunity with our organisation, there was another organisation I had in mind I thought may also be suitable. So I said, do you want me to pass on the details? So if you can also help them.
Yes, so it's about being helpful and thoughtful, mindful, and also if you think there's another opportunity, you'll refer them to somewhere that might be a better fit for them.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, Thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you. I love the kind of entrepreneurial spirit that you've shown by developing Trainbee. It's certainly a gap in the market that definitely needs filling. And again, as we say, a call to action. If you're an agency looking for trainees, or if you're a trainee looking for an agency, trainbee.co.uk. Pop yourself on there and you may find what you're looking for. So, Nikaela Morrison, thank you so much for joining us.
Massive thank you to Nikaela Morrison. And of course, the Trainbee website link is in the show notes. You'll get those by going to counsellingtutor.com, podcast tab. Go make your way to episode 283. You'll get the super duper handout there as well. And of course, all the links from today's episode. This has been episode 283 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast.
Yes, and before we close out today's episode, I've just got a couple of quick favours to ask you, the listener. First, if you've enjoyed and benefited from our conversation today, please leave us a 5-star review on whatever platform you're tuning in from. It generally helps us reach more ears and grow our community. And secondly, if someone in your circle might benefit from our discussions, share this episode on your social media platforms. Word of mouth is powerful, and we really do appreciate every share, tweet, or post that brings listeners into our community. And always thank you for being such a vital part of our journey, and I hope that we're a vital part of your journey too. And as always, stay grounded and stay safe.
Take the stress out of your counselling studies and get the support of Rory and I by joining us in the Counselling Study Resource. See how Counselling Study Resource can help you. Visit counsellingtutor.com. That's counsellingtutor.com.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Find the show notes for this episode by visiting counsellingtutor.com.